Mantelpiece ornaments, a candlestick, and picture frames crashed to the floor all at once, though no one was standing anywhere near them. It was Sunday evening in June 1906, in the Splot district of Cardiff, and Mrs. Williams had just put a poker, tongs, and saucepan back in the scullery, thinking the strangeness was already over. A few weeks earlier, a young woman staying at the house found her clothes mysteriously torn to shreds, followed by a set of unexplained raps on the kitchen wall. It was strange enough to unsettle the household, but nothing prepared the family for what would happen that Sunday night. Mrs. Williams found a poker, tongs, and saucepan scattered on the kitchen floor and put them back in place. By early evening, the mantelpiece ornaments, a candlestick, and picture frames all crashed to the floor at once, and a drawer she hadn't touched was found open, its contents strewn across the room. She sent for a policeman that night. He told her he'd like to see something happen while he was there, and moments later, a candlestick flew off the table, and the oilcloth beneath it crumpled up in front of him. The following morning brought worse. Mrs. Williams found the kitchen kettle knocked from the hob, crockery smashed across the floor, and drawers upstairs emptied onto the ground. Next door, lodger George Harris carried 3 cups into the front room for safekeeping, only to watch them return to the kitchen on their own and shatter. Mrs. Jones reported carpets rolling themselves up, a toilet set moved to the floor, and a plate rolling into the kitchen and smashing without anyone near it. A crowd of around 500 people gathered outside the houses, drawn by the growing local rumours, and police officers had to be brought in specifically to manage the street. Amid the chaos, one police constable watched 3 mats in the passage roll themselves up and march into the dining room, stopping one with his own foot. A second constable saw the cover of a teapot lift itself off the table and settle gently onto the carpet, entirely on its own. Principal E.H. Griffiths and Professor Burrows of the University College of South Wales investigated and suggested young Elsie was responsible, but their own theory couldn't account for what officers had personally witnessed. The Jones family, at number 17, gave up and moved out entirely before the week was over, taking every last possession with them. What actually happened on Seymour Street that June was never explained. And Splot held on to the story as its most talked-about mystery for years afterward. On Cardiff Road in Bargoed is a large 3-storey house called Gladstone Villa, which is now a care home, but at the time of the encounters was home to Bill and Rita Higgs, their daughter Caroline Dexter, her husband Douglas, and their infant son Andrew, born in August 1969. Not long after Andrew's birth that summer, small tapping sounds began somewhere in the house. The taps grew into something more physical fast enough that the family had no time to dismiss it as an old house settling. Every night, footsteps crossed the main bedroom floor directly above the living room, loud enough that the family would turn down the television to listen to them moving overhead. Bill, a former miner at Bargoed Colliery, took to pointing at the ceiling and saying he's by there, and the family gave it a name for whatever it was. Johnny. The activity escalated well past footsteps. Electrical cables were pulled loose from the walls upstairs. A glass bottle was hurled across a bedroom directly at Bill, narrowly missing his head before shattering against the wall. One night, Caroline went upstairs to wake Douglas for his shift at the local bakery and found his slippers thrown out onto the landing, with a heavy ironing board balanced squarely on top of him as he slept. While Andrew was still a baby, his mother checked his cot and found his pillow torn cleanly in half. Frightened, the family called the local police. Officers arrived and searched the house, eventually opening the attic hatch to check the space above. According to those who were there, the officers were visibly unsettled by the atmosphere upstairs. It was checked only briefly, before he left the building. Police initially suspected Douglas himself was behind the disturbances, until it became clear the activity kept happening even on nights he was away working at the bakery, with which they were able to rule him out. Caroline reported seeing a silent figure standing behind the living room sofa, dressed in a monk-like hood with no visible face, seemingly watching the room. On other occasions, the family heard a baby crying uncontrollably from inside a closed, empty closet, with no child anywhere near it. A medium named John Matthews visited and stated an earthbound spirit remained in the house, while an Anglican priest, Reverend Graham Jones, performed a blessing that brought the family temporary peace. Later research turned up two possible explanations tied to the property's own history. A baby had reportedly died in the house during the 1920s, and a medieval monastery had once stood nearby. Neither fact was ever confirmed as the cause, and the Higgs and Dexter family lived with Johnny, on and off, for nearly a decade before the activity eventually faded. In January 1965, 20-year-old Marcia Howell moved into a terraced house on Rhondda Street, in the Mount Pleasant area of Swansea, along with her husband David, their 3-year-old daughter Beverly, their infant son Gareth, and Marcia's grandmother, Glendora. From their very first nights in the house, the family felt an unsettling choking sensation, though nothing more happened for months. By early December of that year, the mild unease of those first nights turned into something the family could no longer ignore. It began with a bottle of children's medicine, sitting on the mantelpiece, rising into the air on its own and flying straight at Marcia. Terrified, she grabbed her infant son and ran out to meet David as he came home from work. When the couple returned to the living room together, they found it in total disarray. Heavy furniture flipped completely upside down, clothing scattered across the floor. The next day brought worse. After hearing a crash from the lounge, the family found the television thrown to the floor with armchairs piled on top of it. Upstairs, a heavy double bed had been flipped over, landing directly on top of the baby's cot. As David walked further into the house, another crash rang out from the kitchen lean-to, where the cooking stove had been tipped onto the floor. Convinced an intruder had broken in, the family called the police. Detectives arrived to find the upstairs bedroom door jammed shut from the inside and had to force it open. Inside, they found the flipped bed and the wrecked furniture, with no sign of forced entry and no way anyone could have caused the damage and then locked the room from within. The South Wales Evening Post ran the story on its front page, and police officers went on record, saying they were completely baffled. As the case drew local attention, Marcia's grandmother Glendora pointed out to reporters that none of her own belongings had been touched, while everyone else's had, as if whatever was responsible had chosen its targets deliberately. A 74-year-old security officer named Harry Holmes, who had spent decades investigating haunted houses, arrived with a custom-built device he called Harry's Box, fitted with a bell that would ring if anything in the room moved. Holmes sat alone in the house for 24 hours with his box and a packet of cigarettes. The bell never rang, but he reported seeing a foot-long streak of light hovering above the mantelpiece. A local priest visited alone, spending 5 minutes in prayer and sprinkling holy water through the rooms. Whatever peace it brought didn't last long enough for the family, who packed up and left the street for good shortly afterward, vowing never to return. The police file on Rhondda Street was closed without an explanation, and no one has ever accounted for how a house full of ordinary furniture ended up flipped, thrown, and toppled in the space of 2 days. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, a lawnmower repair shop known as Mower Services in Cardiff became the site of one of the longest-running poltergeist cases in British history. Staff nicknamed the presence Pete, and over the course of 14 years, it made itself known to workers, customers, and eventually a long line of outside investigators. The activity began with small, strange occurrences around the workshop, tools shifting, stones thrown across the floor, and objects appearing that no one could account for. It escalated to the point where staff, half joking, began speaking directly to Pete, asking him for things, and getting an answer. Police officers first witnessed the activity firsthand after being called out to investigate a suspected break-in at the workshop. While on the premises, they saw objects swinging on their own and heard rocks being thrown by something they couldn't see. Insurance assessor Gareth Lucas, visiting after the same break-in, reported hearing odd noises and watching a stone whiz across the floor. 2 priests from a nearby church came to investigate independently and witnessed a stone flying across an empty room, while Reverend Mike Fuller, of the neighbouring Baptist church experienced stones striking his office window when no one was outside to throw them. Pete's manifestations grew stranger still. For about 5 years, staff could ask him for money and coins would appear around the workshop, old pennies, and on some occasions notes. The notes would turn up wedged in wall cracks, stuck to ceiling tiles, and once a note dropped directly into a cup of tea. He fetched objects too, just ask for a plug, and he'd throw a spark plug, ask to get this together, and he produced a staple. A single paperclip left on a desk once brought an entire box of paperclips crashing down moments after a worker joked about wanting more. Professor David Fontana, a parapsychologist sent by the Society for Psychical Research, made unannounced visits specifically to rule out any prank. On one visit, he walked in just as a stone was thrown across the room, bouncing off machinery, while every visible hand in the workshop, including the owners, stayed still. Fontana went further, throwing stones into a corner. The activity seemed centered on and watching them come flying back at him. He later reported the entity showed intent and a rudimentary intelligence. One worker, Fred, eventually saw the source directly. A thin, grey-skinned boy in 1940s clothing, cub cap and boots included, his face little more than a featureless outline, seated quietly on a top shelf. When the business eventually moved premises, the activity reportedly followed a family member home, until a medium offered a method that brought it to an end. 14 years of police officers, clergy, an insurance assessor, and a university parapsychologist all describing the same kind of impossible event never produced an explanation, only one of the most thoroughly corroborated poltergeist cases British history has on record. At around 3 a.m. on a Monday in October 2019, internal motion alarms triggered inside the locked ATIK Nightclub in Wrexham, empty and closed for the night. The alert brought General Manager Matt Evans to the scene, expecting nothing more than a routine false alarm or an attempted break-in. Every door to the building was confirmed locked from the outside, and a check with security staff found no sign of forced entry anywhere on the premises. With no obvious cause for the alarm, Evans and the security team turned to the club's own CCTV system to see what had actually triggered it. The footage showed a heavy bar stool sliding across the empty dance floor entirely on its own, before being slammed down hard. Hanging decorations strung from the ceiling swayed back and forth with no draft or movement to account for it, and a plastic wet floor warning sign was thrown clear across the room. No person appeared anywhere in the frame. Security staff and police reviewed the same footage and confirmed the building had been fully locked and empty throughout, with every possible entry point checked and accounted for. There was no intruder on camera, no staff member still inside, and nothing to explain how a bar stool had moved on its own in a locked, empty nightclub at 3 a.m. The footage was never explained, and no further incidents were reported at the club afterward. It remains one of the few modern poltergeist cases with actual moving footage of the activity itself, rather than only witness testimony, closing out Wales's run of police-witnessed cases on its most directly verifiable piece of evidence yet. Police officers weren't the only ones drawn into Wales's hauntings. Bishops, priests, and even university researchers found themselves standing in the middle of the same unexplained events, called in not to confirm a ghost story, but to make sense of something they couldn't walk away from. In 1905, in the Welsh market town of Lampeter, the Howell family began hearing strange sounds in their home, tramping feet and odd noises coming from the garret above. The disturbance soon focused on 11-year-old Jack, and knocking began in the walls beside his bed at night, persistent enough that it lasted until daylight. The knocking wasn't random. It repeated the exact number of taps given to it, and could drum out the beats of familiar tunes, convincing the household this was no ordinary structural noise. Word spread quickly through the town, and neighbours, including a clerk from Mr. Howell's own office, began arriving at the house to witness it for themselves. One elderly local woman told a newspaper she had heard the same kind of disturbance years earlier, while working as a servant in that very house for a completely different family. When Jack was moved into a different room entirely, The bed itself began to move on its own, its headboard banging against the wall. Mr. Howell could stop it briefly by physically holding the frame still, but the moment he let go, the movement started again. Household members also reported the rustle of dresses moving through empty rooms and sightings of two separate apparitions, a lady dressed in black and a woman in a long white robe. Dr. John Lloyd, the Bishop of Swansea, arrived with the Reverend Charles Harris to investigate directly. Drawing on the same method used in the historic Cock Lane ghost case more than a century earlier, they gathered around Jack's bed and waited for the knocking to resume, establishing a code of 3 knocks for yes and 1 for no. Through this code, the entity claimed that a double murder had taken place in the house and that money remained hidden inside the chimney. The bishop's questions were later criticized by observers as leading, prompting the spirit to confirm exactly the kind of sensational claim being asked about. Even so, some old clothing was genuinely discovered on the property afterward, adding a strange note of physical evidence to a case built almost entirely on wrapping and suggestion. Bishop Lloyd never reached a firm conclusion. He told reporters his mind remained open and admitted he could not account for the knocking, but stopped short of accusing anyone of trickery, saying he didn't want to suggest collusion without proof. He left the Howell house, by his own account, thoroughly befuddled. Whether Jack was the source of a genuine disturbance, or the architect of an elaborate hoax that fooled a bishop, has never been settled, and Lampeter's own place in the history of Welsh hauntings remains as unresolved today as it was in 1905. In March 1899, the home of Mrs. Phillips in Burry Port, Carmarthenshire, became the site of a strange nightly disturbance. It began with the sound of footsteps moving through the rooms after dark, footsteps with no one attached to them. Before long, the footsteps were joined by something stranger still. The sound of a piano being played beautifully somewhere in the house, with no one sitting at the keys. The property's owner, David John Badger, grew frustrated enough with the rumours to complain publicly in the local press, worried the stories would damage the value of his building. Witnesses described the presence as heavy-footed, occasionally heard jumping down from a landing window onto the floor below, with a solid physical thud, rather than anything ghostly or faint. Locals in the area began reporting sightings of the same figure near the nearby copper works tip, describing it as wrapped in a strange foam. The sightings continued at the tip until one local resident, finally out of patience, threw a brick directly at the figure. Whether the brick actually struck anything solid was never confirmed, but the sightings at the copper works tip stopped from that point on. The footsteps and the piano music at Mrs. Phillips' house were never explained, and Burry Port's own ghost, silenced by nothing more dramatic than a thrown brick, never returned. In February 1997, near Mold in North Wales, 2 visiting tourists reported seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary in a field belonging to a farm owned by David and Rosemary Gower. It wasn't until October the following year that anything strange began happening inside the Gower home itself. What started as a single reported vision in a field grew, over more than a year, into a much stranger and more sustained set of events inside the farmhouse, drawing in family, visitors, and eventually a formal scientific investigation. Strange stains and carvings, religious images and Welsh words began appearing on the walls both inside and outside the house. The same religious phrases turned up in places no one could explain, inside computer files, on printed documents, and within outgoing emails sent from the property. Family members and visitors reported seeing shadowy, monk-like figures moving through the house, nicknaming the presence Brother Doli. Alongside the wall markings and apparitions came loud knocking, sudden drops in temperature, pools of water forming on dry floors, electrical glitches, and heavy objects sliding across tables on their own. The case drew the attention of psychologist Dr. Michael Daniels and investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, who set up time-lapse surveillance cameras and directly tested the wall stains. Photographs taken at the farm repeatedly showed odd, monk-shaped anomalies of light that no one could account for. Investigators found that some of the physical wall markings could plausibly have been faked, But the sheer volume and range of events, wall carvings, computer anomalies, temperature changes, and photographed apparitions together left the research team genuinely divided over whether Brother Doli was a real psychical event or an elaborate, sustained deception. That division was never resolved, and the case remains one of the more scientifically scrutinized hauntings in Welsh history, without ever reaching a clear verdict either way. And there we finish these stories. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep watching the shadows. Good night.